Hey guys, and welcome to a new EDIUS 8.2 tutorial. My name's Matt Scott, and today we're going to be looking at a couple of brand new features that are super exciting. And if you know me, you know I love color correction, and one of these, or both of these tools, are actually going to enhance your color correction abilities within EDIUS, which are already awesome. We love EDIUS. It's fast, it's flexible, you can do so much in it, and it's just getting better and better. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll jump straight into it. I got some footage here that I shot with a Canon 5D Mark II, an amazing little old camera that has lasted me a long time, especially now that you can shoot RAW with the thing. So I shot a whole bunch of clips with my good mate Rob Benici, and I don't know if you know, but I've moved all the way out to Tasmania, down to Tasmania, and let me tell you, this is a beautiful place to live, especially if you love adventure and cameras, and yeah, take your cameras to adventures. So let's go ahead and have a look at these new features and how they're going to help us color grade not any footage in general, not only any footage in general, but especially these new features are going to help us color grade what's called log images, or images that were shot flat. So if you've been shooting video, you know, in the last couple of years, you definitely would have come across that term, shooting flat, shooting log, S-Log2, all these things. So what do they mean? Well, basically, when you record an image like this, for example, you'll notice, especially if we have a look at the scopes, that our scopes show us that there's no real contrast in this image. We don't have a black point down here, so 0 represents pure black in our luminance scale, 100 represents pure white. So we do have some nice highlights up here in the out of focus background there, but we have no black point. So what we need to do is fix this image, and we've deliberately recorded it flat to maximize the dynamic range. Now we have to fix things like the saturation and the contrast. So when you go ahead and do something like that, I've done tutorials before that sort of show you how to do it using EDIUS's standard color correction tools, and let's just quickly run over those right now. So we'll go to Video Filters, Color Correction, and the first thing we're going to use is a YUV curve. So, I mean, I've done this before, I've showed you this before, but I just want to reiterate how important these new filters are and what they're going to help us do. So generally speaking, what we want to do, and I am just going to rush over this, and we're going to adjust the luminance using the Y quadrant, and we're going to bring our shadows down to 0. So you can see here on the waveform monitor that our shadows are now coming down to 0. And then we're going to get our highlights and add an anchor point on our highlights and increase those. So what we've done technically and essentially is we've expanded the dynamic range, and you can see that before and after here. There's the original log image, and there's after a luminance curve. We've actually created contrast, and things are looking pretty good. But now we need to add saturation, and we also need to correct the white balance. You can see the white balance is off here as well, up to the left, to the yellow and the red. We need to bring that closer to the center. We'll have a look at that in a second, but first of all we need to add saturation. Now, if you've ever used the YUV curve before, or if you've ever done a tutorial where I teach you how to use this tool, you'll notice that I show you how to use the Y component, but I sort of just say, hey, don't worry about the U and the V. And for good reason, because I mean, it's great that we have access to these curves, to these channels. The U and the V represent the remaining color components of the video, but unfortunately they're not very intuitive and they're quite difficult to use. So creatively, I mean, you can muck around with them and say, yeah, cool, I want to make this kind of like an orange looking video, and you can put some points here and that. But really, it's not an accurate tool. It's not a tool that I'm really going to be able to use efficiently. So one thing we can do efficiently with it is just destroy all color information, just flatten out the U and the V. So if you're never aware of that, that's a cool little tip, so that you can destroy all color information so it's gone. Or you can increase saturation. But increasing saturation, like I say, is a fiddly task. So let me show you how to do it. We need to add some curves here in the U and the V, and then we need to look at our image and watch our scopes and try and balance the image this way. So what I'm doing here is adding quite a lot of saturation and trying to balance both the white balance and the saturation at the same time. And I've kind of done that, right? And I'm just looking at it by eye, I'm looking at my scopes, and if we have a look at before and after, we've gone from a log image to a contrasty saturated image. The problem is, let's go ahead and press OK. The longer you look at that, you're going to think that that's okay, right? But I can see some problems straight away, and maybe you can too. For a start, my highlights aren't white anymore, and they probably should be white. my shadows have a blue tint in them as well, and that's not cool. So these two things are not cool, and that's why I never sort of suggest to use the U and the V component unless you're going to flatten out the color. So let's just default those and leave our luminance curve as is, and let's have a look at adjusting contrast or saturation another way. So we'll go Effect, the color balance, we'll drop that on, and again I am rushing through this because we've done it before. Let's just increase chrominance. Okay, so now we've increased saturation. And this is, a great way to increase saturation in any image. We're just linearly adjusting every pixel by this amount. But now we have a problem with white balance, and we can try and fix the white balance. You can see that the image is very red, so we're going to push cyan and blue into it. And then you can see that what we've done is we've centered up our vector scope over here, and our white balance is looking much better. So again, things are looking pretty good, not too bad, but are our whites white? Maybe they are. They're looking much better than we did with the YUV curve. And if we just split before and after, things are looking better. But this is strictly working in a YUV color space. And like we said before, EDIUS works in a YUV color space, so being able to process images in RGB might seem trivial, or, what's the point of it? Well, that's what I'm going to show you right now. Actually, let me leave those. And I'm going to duplicate this layer and delete those filters. So now we have two layers here. The top layer does not have any filters. Bottom layer has the YUV curve and the the saturation and white balance fix. So what we're going to do now is have a look at this brand new filter. I know I've been rambling, but let's go ahead and grab it. So we'll go to Effects, we'll go to Video Filters, we'll go to Color Correction, and you'll see down here we have one called the Primary Color Correction filter, and if you expand the bin you'll be able to see the description of the filter. Adjust the color and brightness of an image in an RGB range. So this is super cool. Alright, so let's go ahead and drop this new primary color correction filter on top of our clip, and then the information tab pops up showing us that we have a new filter. So let's double click that, and let's just quickly go over what we have here. You may recognize some things here, like the three-way color corrector. It's just positioned a little bit differently and looks a little bit different. You'll also notice we have a color space source and destination tab here, which I'm going to get into in a moment. We have an exposure setting, which is nice. We can just adjust the exposure of an image, so it feels like similar to the raw controls that we see in Red Cine X or any sort of raw deburring program. It allows us to adjust white balance, so we can fix white balance issues and tint issues, and we can adjust exposure. So this is really cool. But what I wanted to start with though is the actual curves and how they differ to the YUV curve. So basically it's the same principle though. We have a box, and inside the box we have anchor points which allow us to change values. For example, we want to change the highlights in an image but maintain the shadows. So if we do that, you'll notice the shadows don't move. You'll also notice, if you play around with these curves compared to the YUV curves, is they're not as I guess bouncy, if you know what I mean. I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I grab an anchor point up here in the highlights and I push it up to the left, nothing really happens at all in my shadows. If I pull it down to the right, nothing again happens in my shadows. It doesn't really bounce around like it does with the YUV curve. So let's have a quick revisit of the YUV curve for a second. I'm going to double click that, add an anchor point in here, and you can see when I move these around, it bounces and reacts along the chain. So already we're seeing a difference in how the filter works in itself. So you will notice that, and it's actually easier to use, I find. So that's a welcomed change as well. So let's go back to our new primary color correction tool, scroll down to the curve, and what we are going to do is, while we're clicked on the Y component of the curve, we're going to make sure we've got our scopes up, have a look at our waveform monitor. Let's go straight to the shadows here, and let's just drop that down like this, and let's just create some contrast here like we did with the previous filter. Something like that looks pretty good. I'm just going to raise my highlights a little bit as well, making sure not to go above 100. So what we're just doing here is maximizing the dynamic range that we captured in the log image. So we can play with our midtones as well, but I'm thinking they're looking pretty good as is. Maybe just bring back some of that contrast a little bit. So just have a play with these curves. You'll notice there's 3 defined points. So it's a little bit different to how the YUV curves, but definitely there's more than enough control within this curve. Technically speaking, there's actually 5 points. So you have the 3 middle anchor points, plus you have a white point. So you can actually drag the white point down. And you can play with the shadows as well. You can really crush the shadows if you like. So you really got 5 points there. But the point is that we're actually working in an RGB color space. So what does this mean? What's the difference? Well, the first difference that I notice, and that hopefully you notice as well, is when you adjust the Y component of an RGB curve, you're actually introducing saturation. So let's go ahead and press OK on this and disable it. And I'm going to delete or just turn off this color balance filter. So going back to the Y component, if we just play with the Y component of a YUV curve, saturation does not change whatsoever. The tint, the color, nothing changes unless you touch the U and the V component. So that can be good, but mostly it's annoying because usually you need to add saturation later, right? Like we have here with the color balance filter. So instead, with the new color correction filter, let's quickly go back to it. When you adjust the curve and you create a new contrast curve, you'll notice saturation increases. So this is awesome. This is quicker. This allows us to work quicker. And not only that, but we also have built-in effects within this one filter that allow us to do things at once. So for example, now we can increase saturation here as well. So this is awesome, and you can see saturation is increasing in the vector scope. So let's go ahead and have a look at fixing our white balance issue. Now generally fixing white balance issues is a matter of playing with your shadows, midtones and highlights and fixing it that way, and that's the way I've sort of taught you to do it in the past with a three-way color corrector. But thankfully we have this awesome white balance slider now in the same filter, which allows us to just fix white balance very, very quickly. So as you can see, both with your eye and by looking at the vector scope here, our white balance is way off. It's too warm, there's too orange here. And that's because I shot this, I think, at 8,000 Kelvin, which is clearly way too warm. And what we need to do is go to the temperature of the white balance and push it towards blue. Because remember, if we want to correct orange, we want to slide our slider towards blue. So let's go to the temperature and slide it to the left. And look how easy that is. If we go too far, we're going to start polluting our shadows and creating blue shadows. So let's just back it off more to the right here. And check it out. We've got this beautiful color correction happening here. Perfect whites, nice skin tones, no pollution in the shadows, and awesome saturation. Now, another way is we're looking at it with our eye, so we can see the white balance is roughly pretty good at -22 here. But we can also have a look at our vector scope to help us, guide us to a proper white balance. Because if we just reset that temperature slider now and have a look at where the vector scope sits, all of the color is off center. So if we slide that to the left, it goes back towards the middle. Now, I'll just quickly talk about the vector scope as well and how it can be very useful, especially when doing white balance adjustments. So you'll notice that there are some boxes around here, or some guides, some labels here. So R for red, B for blue, G for green, and then we have yellow, magenta and cyan. Now what happens if we slide this color temperature slider to the left? All of our colors, the hues, get pushed towards cyan and blue. That makes sense, right? And if we slide it to the right, 180 degrees, they all move towards yellow and red. That also makes sense. But what if you want to adjust the magenta and the green? Well, check it out. That's what this tint slider's for. So what we want to do is, just by eye, we want to move this closer to the center. Right? We're also looking at it by eye as well. And then what we can do is actually push this towards green a little bit, because you can see that a lot of this vector scope is showing us that a lot of the colors are sitting up towards magenta. And you know, there's quite a green background here. These are green leaves. And maybe the white balance vector scope plot is still not centered perfectly, so we need to move it down to the left hand side. And to do that, we push a little bit of green in there, and you can see now we're getting a really nice, really nicely balanced image where the skin tones, well, I've probably pushed a little bit too much green in there. Skin tones are looking much nicer, not too pink. The green's looking stronger, and the blues are perfect. We've got a really nice white balance happening here. So what we've done is we've used the Y component of an RGB curve to add contrast. We've pushed a little bit of saturation in here, up to about 30, and then we've adjusted the white balance using our temperature and tint. This is an awesome tool. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. Now, as soon as you press OK, remember that EDIUS works in a YUV color space. So even though this color correction is processed in RGB, once we get back to EDIUS, we get that beautiful real-time performance of 10-bit YUV. This is awesome. Just like any other color correction filter within EDIUS, we can just copy and paste this to our next clip. So let's go ahead and grab a clip here, drag it down to the timeline, and as you can see, here's our color corrected clip, still working in real time, mind you. This is beautiful stuff. And let's go ahead, click on that clip, go to the information tab, and this will show us the color correction that we've just created. Now what I can do is drag that down onto our next clip, and that will take on the same color correction. And check it out, look at the huge difference here, going from a log image to an RGB processed color corrected image that has perfect white balance, nice contrast, no clipping highlights or shadows. Remember, we can always double click on that filter, go back in here and just back our highlights off a little bit if we wanted to, and drop our mids a little bit. As I feel like his arm's a little bit hot there, so that's looking much nicer. Remember, we can always preview the before and the after, so just like any other color correction filter within EDIUS. And go ahead and press OK. So now we can just compare these two shots. Obviously quite different. One, I'm sort of getting a lot more flare pointing up to the sky there, and I don't have a hood on the 85. And then this one, we've got a much darker background, a much higher contrast ratio between the foreground and the background. But they're basically looking pretty good in terms of skin tones and the color of the t-shirt and things like that. So, I mean, very quickly we can start matching shots. This is great. I'm really loving this tool. So let me show you a couple of other features that are part of it as well that I haven't gone over. So let's add this third clip now. And what I'll do is just grab this filter and drop it on, so just like we did a second ago. But as you can see, it doesn't really work for this one. Exactly the same color correction, but how come it looks crap? Well, let's go ahead and have a look. Every shot is different. Every shot, maybe I shot this an hour apart and the sun's temperature slightly changed. Maybe there was more shadow, there was more diffused light, and all these things affect how the image looks. So what we want to do now is just analyze the image with our eyes and have a look at the scopes. So it's a bit of a crash course on scopes as well. You can see this big spike in magenta over here, between blue and magenta. So first of all, what we want to do is maybe fix that. And you can also see that the image is quite blue. So if we go to our temperature slider and move it more towards orange, back a little bit, keeping an eye on our whites as well, and let's just add a little bit more green to the image to try and counteract that magenta. So you can see here as I slide the tint towards the right, now the image is starting to look more balanced. Isn't this cool? It's so much easier than using a three-way color corrector, because you don't have to fiddle around with the mid-tones and try and push it in the right direction. It's just very simple. Is it blue or orange? And then once you've corrected that, is there a tint? Let's try and fix the tint. So let's counteract magenta by pushing in green. Now that we've done that, I feel like we need to maybe add a little bit more saturation. And let's have a look at our scopes. I feel like contrast, maybe midtones could be pushed up a little bit. Remember, this is never going to look the same as the other shots, because the other shots had a much harsher backlight. This one's a lot softer, but let's go ahead and press OK. And, you know, we're definitely going to have to do some work on this shot. But that's what I'm excited to do as well. We're going to get into some serious color correction stuff. Now let's go back to our bin, and I'm going to show you another sort of component of that new color correction filter. So let me just grab a clip down here. I'm going to make some of these available on the blog as well, so you'll be able to download these and play along. So what I'll do is just grab this epic shot of Rob climbing up a mountain. God, like, this is only 45 minutes from my house. And this sort of adventure is just, it's epic. But I was too scared to climb up there. But anyway, let's go ahead and go to Effects, and we'll go Video Filters, Color Correction, Primary Color Corrector. And again, we'll just drag that down to our clip. Make sure our scopes are open. Double click the Primary Color Correction tool. And one thing we sort of haven't played with is exposure. And I'm going to get into that maybe a little bit later when we start using the color space conversion section. In this case, most of my exposures are pretty, dare I say, spot on for this entire shoot, so I don't really need to adjust exposure. I'm just going to use the YUV curve to achieve my contrast. So I'm just going to lower contrast, or increase contrast actually, lower my shadows down like that. And I'm just going to raise highlights a little bit as well. This time not going all the way up, and just bump up my mids a smidge. and then things are looking pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to single screen mode. I've got a keyboard shortcut set up for that, so I just press number 1. That goes to single screen mode. Number 2 switches to dual mode. So usually when I'm doing color correction, I like to have a bigger image, especially if I'm on a single screen like this. You can always go to view and just change it to single or dual mode. So here we are in single mode. Let's go ahead and have a look at the primary color corrector. So next thing I want to do after adding my contrast curve is add some saturation. And you can see that change reflected on my vector scope over here. Again, everything's been shot too warm, so I may have got exposure right on the day, but I definitely didn't get white balance right on the day. And let's go ahead and fix our white balance. Add a little bit more saturation. And I'm just going to warm it up a smidge. Alright, so that's what you could call a balanced image. And if I just show you the before and after here, full screen, you can see that with some simple adjustments in RGB color space, we've done some, we're at a great place, you know what I mean? A great place to start grading and really getting the most out of this image. So let's jump back into the filter properties again. We'll double click on the primary color correction filter. And let's just scroll down to the curve component. And this time I want you to have a look at the RGB values. Now, remember when we tried to use the YUV component back here? Let me just quickly bring this back up again. We had our Y, which represents our luminance, and we have our U and V, which represents the chrominance channels, the color channels, the remaining components of the video. Unfortunately, it's not very intuitive to use. How do I, for example, add blue to the shadows or add yellow to the highlights? I can go, okay, so yellow's there. And I can try and push that back. Now my blacks look grey. It's just difficult to use. It doesn't really make sense. No one can use those, can they? Creatively? I don't know. So let's go back to this image. And what I want to do is show you how intuitive and awesome RGB curves are. So we'll double click the filter, scroll down to the RGB. Let's click on R for red. And let's go ahead and play with these curves for a second. Before I do, I want you to imagine that this box defines two colors, red and the opposite of red. So when you look at one of these color wheels, and let's just say that this is the color red around here, then this is the opposite of the color red, right? So this box contains both of those colors. Green, well, the green component of the RGB curve is similar, and so is blue. So green contains green and the opposite of green, which is magenta. Blue contains blue and the opposite of blue, which is yellow. So let's go back to the R curve for a second, and I want you to have a look at this image. Remember, we've balanced this image perfectly. Our blacks are black, our whites are white, our greys are grey, our saturation's nice. If we start mucking around with these RGB curves, it's going to screw things up, but it could also make it look awesome. So we'll go to the R component, and remember that this is broken up into two colors. So if we grab the midpoint here and pull it down to the right, what we're doing is subtracting red. If you pull a curve away from the center, pull it down, you're taking red out of this midtone area. Similarly, if I grab that same point and push it up to the left, now I'm adding more red. I'm taking away blue. I'm adding red to the midtones. So what if I put that back in the middle, and this time I grab the highlights point and I push that up. Now I'm only adding red to the highlights. So you can see the highlights of the rocks are starting to go red. And similarly, if I pull that down to the right, now I'm subtracting red from the rocks, which is leaving blue and green. Okay, and you can see that our scopes are reflecting that exactly. So if we put that back up here, now what I want you to do is go to the shadow point. And similarly, we push it up to the left, we're adding red to the shadows. We push it down, and we're adding blue to the shadows. Now this is an awesome creative tool, and it's much more intuitive than trying to use those YUV curves. Because instantly what I can do is I go to my Y, and I add some contrast. We've done this 1,000 times, right? Add some contrast. We've got nice saturation here. We've got a balanced image. Let's go to our red channel, and let's just add a touch of blue to the shadows. Now remember, it's quite subtle, but I've done it. So now his jeans have a blue tint to them. Now these shadows in the rocks have a blue tint. All these shadows in the trees also have a blue tint. But what's awesome is we've maintained the rest of the red in the midtones and the highlights. So basically what we've just done is created an awesome filmic look just using this really simple curve that is, before is much more difficult to achieve. You basically have to fluke doing it with the YUV component. So what we've just done is added a nice blue tint to the shadows, but what about the highlights? Let's scroll down, go to the blue curve, and the opposite of blue is yellow. So I want to add some yellow to the highlights. So all I do is go to the highlight component and just pull it down, pull blue away. I'm taking blue out of this. So if I push it up, you can see that all the highlights on the rocks go blue. If I pull it down, all the highlights on the rocks go yellow and the highlights on his skin goes yellow. So what we've just done is created this awesome filmic look. Check it out. And what we can do is we can copy and paste this look, and we can always modify the looks. Let's go back to the primary color corrector. Let's go back to the saturation slider and maybe take a little bit of saturation out of there. Maybe let's add a little bit of magenta in there to counteract that green sort of tint that's going on. And remember, we can always cool things off and warm them up as well. So not only is it an amazing quick color correction tool, it's also a really cool looks creator or filter, I guess film look creator that's much easier than any of the other tools that we've had before in EDIUS, because we can do it all with one tool. Let's go ahead back to this clip and try dragging that same color correction filter on. It's not going to look right, but it's looking okay, right? We've got this filmic look going on. Let's just add a bit more magenta, take away a bit of magenta, cool it off some. Let's go back to our contrast. Might just crush my blacks a little bit, keeping in mind I don't want to go below 0. And you can see my highlights have this beautiful sort of yellow look to them. I can go back to my reds and say I'm going to pull more red out of the mids. Check it out, looking pretty sweet. You can get real creative with this stuff, and when you get good at mucking around with those RGB curves, it's just so quick to be able to create a look. Let's have a look at these shadows, neutral shadows. Primary color corrector. I'm going to go down to my red channel, go to the shadows in the red, pull some red out. Check it out, my shadows have gone this sort of blue teal color. I'm going to pull a little bit out of the mids as well. Hells yeah. So quick and easy. And just having that saturation slider there as well, super cool. Alright, so let's wrap up this filter. I want to show you one last thing that is actually really powerful and exciting, because when we're talking about RGB, there's a reason why we need to be able to process things in RGB. It's not just cool, it's not just great that we have access to RGB curves and things like that, and that sort of rich color. I mean, this is a useful tool, but there's also a very, very good reason why Grass Valley have decided to start processing in RGB, or enable it basically. And that's because now we can start transforming footage from one color space to another. So this is super good, this is super useful, especially if you're shooting log, and I'll show you how important it really is. Before we start talking about color space transformations and that sort of top section of the primary color correction filter, I do just want to demonstrate a couple of things using this gradient that I created in Photoshop. So I urge you guys to do this yourself. Just create a gradient in Photoshop that goes from pure black to pure white. And I've imported that into EDIUS, and as you can see when I drop it on the timeline, if you look at the waveform monitor, it shows that it is a perfect linear representation of a graduation between black and white. A little bit outside of the safe broadcast limits there, but all good. So the reason I'm showing you this is because when I first started teaching color correction with EDIUS, I always talked about linear and non-linear tools, and this is the perfect way, and I wish I knew this when I started teaching it back then, let's just quickly have a look at what I'm talking about. So for example, if I go to a color balance filter and drop that on this gradient, double click the filter, if I increase brightness, you'll notice that I'm just linearly adjusting all pixels by the same amount. I'm just pushing them brighter, making the blacks brighter, making the whites brighter, making the midtones brighter. Everything gets brighter. If I make them darker, same thing. It's a very linear adjustment. There is no non-linearness about it. So similarly with contrast, you might think that we're adding a contrast curve by increasing this contrast slider, but we're not at all. We're just pushing our white points in and our black points in. We're crushing both those values, and everything in between just comes along for the ride. So you can see we are increasing contrast here and decreasing contrast, but we're still doing it on a very linear scale. And the same can be said for chrominance or saturation. If we increase saturation to the max, you can see that all shadows, midtones, and highlights all inherit that same amount of saturation. And it's great just to be able to see that literally on the scope. So now what I want to show you is what a non-linear adjustment will do. So we'll go to the three-way color corrector, drag that onto the gradient, double click, and now what we're going to do is have a look at these contrast sliders of the blacks, mids, and whites. Now you may have seen me use these to gently affect midtones, highlights, and shadows, and I think I use the word gently or massage whenever I'm doing those sort of fine-tuned adjustments. And this is a perfect example, and you can see it in action here. So if I go to the midtones here, and I go to the contrast slider and I push that up to the right-hand side, increase that, you can see now we have a bow. We have a non-linear adjustment, and it's very minor, but my midtones are brighter than they used to be, where my highlights and my shadows are relatively the same. Same thing if I go to my highlights and I push those up, they're gently being increased without affecting my midtones or shadows. And then finally, when we go to the contrast slider of the black point, same thing happens. So you can see what we're doing here is we're non-linearly affecting the brightness of an image. Now that's one very gentle way to do it. So what about using the curves? So I always harp on about how the curves are awesome because it's a non-linear adjustment. So let's go to the wavy curve and let's have a look at what would happen if we grab the white point and move that to the left. It does exactly what you would think it would do, right? So when you're adjusting contrast using a linear slider, you're literally just creating your black and white points. You're moving them in and out. Yes, you're creating contrast, but you're not adding a nice gentle roll off between highlights and shadows, and that's why we add a curve. And what's awesome about this example is you can actually see that exact same curve happening right here. So if we add some extra anchor points here, you can see that same curve happening. Pretty cool. Now I always harp on about how it's difficult to use the U and the V, but let's just have a look at what happens when I push this like this. Interesting. So unfortunately these aren't labeled, but what we're looking at here is the middle component is the Y value, the luminance value, and as we move a color channel or push or pull colors around, our luminance is unaffected. Same with the opposite color channels. But the way color correction works is a push and pull system. If you push red into something, you're also subtracting green. So what you're seeing here is the red channel is being pushed or increased while the green is being taken away and decreased. Now this is very important to understand, and even though these aren't very useful in terms of accurately creating sort of color corrections, the RGB curves are, and I'm going to show you how to use those right now. So let's just cancel this and go Effect, Primary Color Corrector, drag that onto our gradient here. And again, if we scroll down here to the curve, the RGB version, we get a very similar result. So now we can adjust contrast like so, and you will see the same shaped curve happening right here on our gradient on the waveform monitor. So this is awesome to be able to just see things happening like that. I found this really fascinating. And then it gets even more fascinating when you go to the RG and B components. So for example, if I want to add blue to the shadows, you would think that maybe I would go to the blue channel, and I could do that. So if I go to the blue channel and I have a look at my box which represents blue, you'll notice that this box actually represents two colors, kind of like our Y, U, and V, the U and V components. But unfortunately, with U and V, it represents all the colors, where these at least have their own boxes, if that makes sense. But what I want to demonstrate here is that blue represent two colors. So if I get my midtones here and I push them up into blue, you'll see my midtones go blue. That makes perfect sense, right? That's pretty cool. That is intuitive. If I go to red and I go to my midtones, or I go to my highlights this time, and I push up the highlights for red, check it out, my highlights go red. Makes perfect sense. Love it. So what is the other color I'm talking about? Well, if you pull red, if you pull it away down to the right hand side, let's go ahead and do that with maybe the shadows this time. If I pull red down, what happens is we get the opposite color of red. If I got my green midtone point and pushed it up to the left, it would add green. So my midtones would go green. If I pull that down to the right, it's going to subtract green and leave magenta, because if we look at our wheel, we have green on this side and magenta on that side. These curves are so awesome and they're really powerful. Let's have a look at our blue channel, and once again, if we push that up to the our midtones up to blue, we get a bluer midtone. If we pull blue away, what is the opposite color of blue? Yellow. So if we pull that down like this, now we're getting yellow. So what we've done is we've created these weird curves, and they're all adding up to create this final result. Now this is part of the basis of how color transformations work and how LUTs work. And there's a lot more to it than that, where they use 3D models to actually manipulate the color. But this 2D model is still very useful for creating your own look. So once you understand how the RGB curves work, they're much more intuitive than just using say your YUV curves, or trying to use the color wheels as well, which I often find more difficult. I find it much easier to be able to say my shadows are down here, my midtones are here, and my highlights are here, and you can always lock points off. I can lock all of my highlights to make sure they stay white. So if I make sure this top right hand side is all the same, now my whites will always stay white. But if I want to muck around with my mids, I can. Check it out, now my mids are this horrible murky green, and if I want to add more red to that, I go to my mids and push red into it. And my shadows are still green. Check it out, I've pulled red out of my shadows, and I've also pushed green into them, but I can make them magenta if I pulled green out of them. So now you can see there's so much control here, and we can always still go back to our luminance curve as well. So this is a very powerful thing to be able to play with, and it's awesome that EDIUS allows to access this. But it's also fascinating to just see it happen in real time on a vector scope and with a gradient. It sort of teaches you what's happening behind the scenes. And keep in mind that we can also have a look at things like exposure too. So let's just reset that curve. And you might think that increasing exposure would be similar to the color balance brightness slider. But remember, if we increase brightness on the color balance slider, it was a linear adjustment. You'll notice as I increase exposure, it's a non-linear adjustment. It's trying to save your shadows still. It's still holding on to shadows while increasing midtones and highlights. Now similarly, if we get the exposure and drop it down to the left, our shadows are intact. Our midtones are just trying to hold on. So this exposure slider is quite different to just changing the brightness, for example. So yeah, it's I urge you to go ahead and play with using a gradient like that. You can even generate some tone, some bars and some patterns in EDIUS like this. I created these ones earlier, and you can have a look at how colors are affected as well. So go to the primary color corrector, grab your tool, and have a look down here, add some contrast. But then what happens if I pull some blue out of the shadows? Check it out, my shadows change, but keep in mind that all colors change as well up here. It's not just grays that get affected. So if we go to the blues and pull them down, all these colors are changing. So it's a great way to analyze and assess what your color balance is actually doing. I urge you to go ahead and give that a go. So we've been talking a lot about grading log images and using non-linear tools to creatively change a log or flat looking image into something pleasing, something much nicer. We're adjusting contrast, we're adding saturation, we're changing white balance and things like that. However, it's good to know, or it's important to know, that all cameras these days that record, say, a log format always have a way to de-log that format, if that makes sense. So of course we're taking creative liberty to affect this shot. I mean, I can get a YUV curve and I can drop that on there, have a look at my scopes, and I can bring my shadows down, my mids up a little bit, raise my highlights. So now I've got some contrast here, great. And you know, then I can go effect and I can go three-way color corrector, and we can add some saturation to the mids, and I could warm it up a little bit. The point is, I'm manipulating both the luminance and the chrominance of this image precisely the way I want to do it, right? And that's great. It's good to be able to have that freedom. All good. But keep in mind that every camera manufacturer basically builds a sensor that sees certain colors and sees certain dynamic range. And when you shoot log, for example, S-log3, the manufacturer has a special LUT, or a lookup table, or a transformation filter that basically transforms this log image into another color space, into a deliverable color space like Rec. 709, for example, which is exactly the color space we're working in right now. But what we're viewing is a log image in Rec. 709. So, I know this might sound a bit confusing, and I'm probably not explaining it very well, but let me show you the final feature of this primary color correction tool and how awesome it really is. So if I grab this and I drag it down onto my Sony clip, which is XAVC, straight from the camera, check it out. It's a little bit different. It automatically corrected the image. What's going on there? Well, if I get an image that wasn't shot on a Sony camera, for example, this one has been shot on the Pocket Cinema camera, and then I transcoded it to DNx HD, for example, and I dropped that on my timeline. It's definitely a log-looking image, right? There's no contrast, not enough saturation. If I go to my effects and go to the primary color corrector, drag that onto the clip, nothing happens. Of course, I can double-click on it, and I can go in, I can start manipulating everything like we've been doing. You know, I can cool that off a little bit, and I can add some saturation, blah, 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 blah. I can start color correcting using that tool. But because EDIUS doesn't really know or recognize this as a camera clip, then it does no auto correction. However, if you drop a clip on there that was shot by a specific camera in a specific log mode that contains metadata describing that, check out what happens. I've got another example here, this one. I shot this in a cave with some Cooke anamorphic lenses on a Sony f55, and you can see here it's still in its native format. It's 4K though, it doesn't matter though. So let's go ahead and drop that on the timeline. And it's going to zoom in here and go effects, primary color corrector, and I'm going to drag that down and bang, instantly does the color correction for you. So this is awesome, but it's also a bit risky, and there's a few things you need to be aware of. So what's great about this is it's saving us time. So let me just fix up this shot. I'm going to go to the layout properties here, and I'm just going to make this 65 by 35 just to fix that aspect ratio. Okay, so that's looking much better. But if we turn our primary color correction filter on and off, this is what I was actually monitoring on the day. The camera was also applying these same corrections. So how is this happening? Let's double click the primary color correction filter and have a look at the color space up the top, because you'll notice my curve hasn't changed, saturation's still the same, there's no white balance adjustments. However, if we turn it on and off, there's quite a big difference here, right? So let's double click the filter and have a look at what's happening here. It's all happening up here automatically using this source and destination color space adjuster. So automatically the clip has been picked up as Sony. EDIUS has read the metadata of the clip and decided that the source is Sony S-Gamut 3 S-Log3. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail about what these mean exactly, but you'll notice that there are two components to every one of these, and it's divided by a slash, a backslash. So the left-hand side of the backslash represents the color space. The right-hand side of the backslash represents the gamma space. Color and gamma, I probably should just say color and brightness. So remember, we keep playing with the Y component of a YUV curve. Well, that's the gamma side of things. then there's the gamut space, which is the color side of things. Now, the reason this is so important, and the reason that it's important that EDIUS works in RGB, is because all of these transformations happen in RGB. And that's why it's essential that EDIUS works in RGB to create accurate transformations between Sony S-Gamma3 S-Log3 to Rec. 709 or BT 709. That's the color space we're working in. So the camera itself, when I'm looking through the monitor, is showing me exactly this. The same shades of yellow, the same brightness around the torch here, the same darkness in the shadows there. So when the camera is set to Rec. 709, that's exactly what it sees. And when I bring it into EDIUS and I drop this primary color correction filter on there, that's exactly what we see, and it happens automatically. This is so, so cool. Now, I need to, I've been told to warn you that this is still in beta, this particular feature, and it's not working 100%, but it's still freaking awesome that it's actually happening at all. So I just wanted to show you that real quick, and also show you a couple of things to run if you run into this while it's in beta and while things aren't functioning 100%. It's still a useful tool, and I'm going to show you why right now. So, for example, let's have a look at this shot, and I'll make sure I've got a taxi in the background. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Effect, Primary Color Corrector, drop that on there. It's going to auto-correct it. But as you can see, if we have a look at our scopes, it's auto-corrected it beyond legal limits. It's blown out highlights on top of the cab. So let's go ahead and have a look at the Primary Color Corrector. Now the reason, or part of the reason why that's happened, is because different cameras, different Sony cameras, have different base ISOs when recording S-Log3. Now, for example, the Sony A7S, which is the one I recorded this image with, is forced to record at 3200 ISO. So what EDIUS doesn't know is the base ISO of each camera. So the F55, for example, doesn't have to record 3200 ISO, it records 800 ISO. So this correction would probably work just fine. But with the Sony A7S, although it does auto-correct it, it's auto-correcting it outside of the range, it's over-correcting it. So what we can do is go to the primary color correction tool, go to the exposure, and we can drop the exposure. So now we're looking at a much nicer level, although there's still some problems with the filter where it blows the highlights out, but it's easy fix. We know how highlights work now. Let's go to our Y curve and bring our highlights down, and we can rescue those highlights in the sky. So now we're working with Sony footage that has been automatically corrected, and even though it didn't do the perfect job, it's very easy to fix, right? So the next thing to realize though is that sure, I mean, I could have done this by myself, right? I could have adjusted that curve, got a nice contrast, and be done with it. But what the difference is, when you use this automatic correction, when you use this destination LUT, source to destination, what you're doing is you're using Sony's colors. You're not using Rec. 709 colors. And let me demonstrate exactly what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this image. So put one on top of the other. How am I going to do that? Like that. And so, because I want to demonstrate something really important. Because you'll often read on the internet, people are struggling to grade S-Log2. Oh, my S-Log2 looks crap. When I grade S-Log3, the colors just don't look right. The skin tones look wrong. And that's because probably they're trying to grade it manually without a LUT. So if I turn this on to not auto, just put it onto project color space, then it essentially works like the normal tool works. Now let's go ahead and just pretend that we didn't automatically correct this, which we haven't now, we've turned it off, and I'm just going to correct this myself. I'm looking at the highlights in the sky, I'm looking at the midtones, alright, looking at my shadows, getting something nice here. I'm also going to increase saturation by a lot. I just want it to, you know, look kind of good. And you know what? That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. So let me just disable this layer and have a look at the auto-corrected layer. So first of all, my luminance values are a little different. So what I might do is just match them. So I'm just going to crop this top layer like this so we can see both. And I'm just going to try and match these. So basically, the auto-corrected one is on the right-hand side, and Matt's corrected one is on the left-hand side. Now remember I said it's all good and well to have full liberty of your color corrections, and what I'm going to do is lower the saturation and try and match these. So I'm looking at his skin tone, for example, and I'm going to try and match the skin. So they're still off a wee bit. I think I need full saturation to actually match him. So that's looking pretty close. You can't really see the join between his arm and his neck there, right? So what I'm going to do is just fix up that crop, get rid of it, and I'm just going to switch these on and off. Look what's happening here. Different colors, different skin tones, different blues, different yellows. Look at the difference in blue and the red bag there. What is important here is the colors are different. Things behave differently when you use the actual manufacturer's LUT or when you try and create your own look. And remember too, while we're here, once this automatic correction has been done, we can still then continue to color correct this as much as we like, right? So we've still got access to our curves. If I wanted to bring those black points down, I can easily modify that. Or, for example, I know the highlights around that torch are there. I know they exist, right? So this automatic correction has blown those highlights out. So what I can do is go to my highlights on my YRGB curve and just bring my highlights down. And as you can see, I can rescue them. I can bring them back. Can I? Surely I can. There we go. That's better. So, even though an automatic correction happens, I just wanted to demonstrate that we can rescue highlights, we can play with shadows, and we can even change white balance, right? So check this out. If I just slide this all the way to the right, I've got a completely different look. I've balanced the daylight balanced LED over there. I've balanced the daylight coming in from behind him, and it's just a completely different shot. I mean, this is how we wanted to shoot it on the day. We wanted it to be more of a sci-fi sort of look, but check it out. Easy to fix a white balance adjustment like that. And we can add or subtract more contrast just playing with our curve. And remember, this is using the automatic correction. So we're using Sony's colors, but we're modifying the luminance in that automatic correction. It's so awesome. I can even go to the red channel, pull some red out of the shadows. And just give it a completely different look. It's a really huge, awesome step forward for Grass Valley and for EDIUS, especially in the color correction realm. Remembering that EDIUS works in 10-bit, if you like, not just 8-bit, and that's so good. And we're going to continue this tutorial on the next one, where I'm going to show you the motion tracker. And this is game-changing for EDIUS. It means with these two tools, we never have to go to DaVinci, basically. That's the way I see it anyway. Yep, so really looking forward to that tutorial. Stay tuned. I'll be back.